Have you ever felt like you're trying to navigate a familiar place, but maybe all the street signs have changed? The landmarks look different. Even the language feels off.
Yeah, like the map you've always relied on just isn't working anymore.
Exactly. And that feeling is, well, it's a bit like the profound shift we're going to unpack today. It's about the world around us, specifically looking at the Christian church in North America.
It really is. What felt like a well-understood spiritual landscape for the church, it's just dramatically transformed.
Mm.
So this deep dive is all about understanding that shift, how the church is facing this entirely new kind of mission field right here at home where, frankly, a lot of the traditional approaches just aren't effective anymore.
So our mission today, then, is to explore what it really means to break the missional code.
Break the code, yeah.
Think of it like cracking a complex puzzle. We want to discern those characteristics, the visible ones and the invisible ones, of a community. The things that make people either resistant or maybe surprisingly responsive to the church and its message.
Right. The goal being to help that spiritual message become more widely known. And we're drawing on insights from several sources that really tackle this challenge head on.
Okay, so let's start by mapping this shifting landscape. Historically, the Christian church was often the first stop for spiritually minded North Americans.
Sure, the default almost.
But our sources show something pretty stark now. Today, it often doesn't even make the top 10 list for people seeking spiritual answers.
It's a huge change. Many people are looking, well, pretty much anywhere but the church.
That really forces a reevaluation, doesn't it, of these long-held assumptions?
It absolutely does. North America's gone through this gradual but really definite cultural shift. It often gets labeled postmodernism.
Right, and that term can sound academic, but it's more than that.
Well, much more. It's not just an art thing or theory. Our sources really emphasize it as a powerful cultural force. It's reshaped core beliefs, behaviors, how people see the world.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Postmodernity, at its heart, is kind of a rejection of that modern view of life. The belief in universal truth, big overarching stories.
Right, the grand narrative.
Yeah, and it embraces something new, often more subjective, more based on experience.
Yeah.
And the result, language has changed, music's changed, the whole worldview's shifted for a lot of people.
And we see hard evidence for this in the unchurched trend.
Okay.
Consider this. The percentage of Christians in the U.S. population, it dropped from 86% in 1990 down to 77% in 2001.
Wow, that's nearly a 10% drop in about a decade.
A significant decline.
Yeah.
And it didn't stop there. By 2004, UCLA's Higher Education Research Institute found something striking among incoming college freshmen.
Okay, what was that?
The number who checked none for religious identity was equal to the number who checked Protestant. Both were 17%.
17% none.
Yeah.
Let that sink in. On college campuses, as many students identifying with no religion as with Protestantism, that's huge.
It's a really profound indicator, especially for younger generations. It just shows this growing gap between the culture and the church.
And not just in famously secular areas, right?
Yeah.
Even in traditionally religious places.
Exactly. Our sources mention Georgia, for example. Even with some churches seeing growth in baptisms and attendance, nearly 70% of the state's entire population remained unchurched.
70%, wow.
Yeah, it shows the old ways of connecting just aren't reaching the majority in many places anymore.
So with these big shifts, culture, religious identity, what's the impact on the churches themselves?
Well, many evangelical churches are still kind of rooted in modern ideas, modern approaches, but the culture around them has moved on.
Right, so they're facing this choice.
A crucial one. Do they stay as these sort of outposts of modernity, or do they take on the tough work, the often uncomfortable work of breaking this new cultural code?
And I suppose some think, preach the gospel, just love people, that's enough.
And you hear that, but the statistics seem to tell a different story. Look, you absolutely cannot grow a biblically faithful church without loving people and preaching the gospel. That's foundational.
Of course.
But loving them also means, well, it means understanding them, communicating with them in their specific cultural context, meeting them where they actually are, not just expecting them to come to us already fluent in our church language.
It brings us right to this idea of breaking the code, a new way of thinking, really.
Exactly. Our sources define it as seeing the unchurched through 3 different lenses.
Okay, what are they?
First, as diverse people groups. Second, as specific population segments. And third, within particular cultural environments.
So not just one big group of unchurched people.
No, not at all. The core idea is to stop seeing them as this homogenous blob and start seeing them as diverse tribes, each with its own landscape, its own language, you could say.
And the mission isn't finished until the message reaches every one of those tribes in a given place.
Precisely. The work isn't done.
So this raises a big question then. What's stopping more churches from adapting if the need is so clear?
Often it boils down to something pretty simple. Personal preferences.
Our own comfort zone.
Exactly. Being missional isn't about doing church the way we happen to like it or what feels comfortable to us. It's about taking the gospel into the context we're called to and then letting the church take the best shape to actually reach that specific culture.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Scripture does tell us to consider others better than yourselves.
It does, Philippians.
So applying that here, it means our personal preferences, maybe even what the current members prefer, shouldn't be the deciding factor. It shouldn't be more important than what the church needs to do missionally.
That's the heart of it. The right question isn't, how loud should the music be or which songs make us happy? The real question is, what kind of church would actually break the code in this specific context?
Okay, so how do we start understanding that context? Breaking that code. The first lens you mentioned was people groups.
Yes. And North America is just incredibly diverse now. That diversity means there isn't just one cultural code to crack anymore.
Makes sense. The demographics alone tell that story.
They really do. Think back to the 1990s, the overall U.S. population grew by about 6%.
Okay.
But Asian populations, they grew by 107%. Hispanics by 53%.
Whoa, huge difference.
Massive shifts. And this means the gospel needs to penetrate. It needs to exegete every culture.
Exegete, that's a term usually used for scripture, right?
Yeah.
Interpreting it carefully.
Exactly. And here it means painstakingly reading and interpreting the culture, understanding its beliefs, its values, its needs, and then speaking the gospel into that specific context.
And the scale of this diversity is just staggering in some places.
It really is. Many large U.S. cities are now majority ethnic. Chicago, 61%, New York, 73%, Los Angeles, 78%.
78% in L.A.
Yeah. And get this, there are more Filipinos and Armenians in L.A. than in any other city on earth, more Cubans in Miami than in Havana.
That just drives home the point, doesn't it?
No.
One-size-fits-all church is just obsolete.
Completely outdated. And beyond those broad ethnic groups, the second lens is specific population segments.
So drilling down further, like age groups, interests, maybe economic factors.
Exactly. Things like that. And the third lens is cultural environments. Geography can play a role, like college campuses creating a common bond.
Which explains why we're seeing more collegiate churches now.
Precisely. Churches planted specifically among universities and colleges. That's a real shift from the older model of campus ministries that were often just, extensions of existing denominations.
Okay, so we understand the need to see the field differently. Now, how does this translate into actually doing ministry differently, contextualizing it?
Well, one of the biggest pitfalls our sources point out is just trying to copy-paste what worked somewhere else.
The Willowback idea you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Trying to replicate Willow Creek or Saddleback.
Exactly. It often fails. And the reason is pretty simple. God uses different methods in different places. The real key isn't copying the letter of someone else's success. It's understanding the process of exegeting your own community.
So thinking about Rick Warren and Saddleback again, his success wasn't just the what, it was the how.
Absolutely. It was rooted in him actually asking his unchurched neighbors, his community, about their values, their needs, their preferences. What were their hang-ups about church? What mattered to them?
So breaking the code means doing that same homework for your specific community.
You got it. Find out what the local objections are, what makes people tick, what language resonates.
And this whole discernment process, it really starts with communication, doesn't it? How we share the message.
It does. Most Christians, maybe subconsciously, start with biblical revelation, thus saith the word of God, chapter and verse.
For us, that signals something important, relevant.
Right. But for someone disconnected from faith, maybe even skeptical, Their starting point is usually relevance. It's, does this have anything remotely to do with my actual life?
That's a very different starting point.
It is, and what's fascinating is seeing the Apostle Paul model this.
How so?
Well, when he spoke to a Jewish audience, like in Pisidian Antioch, he started with Old Testament history. That was their shared foundation.
Okay, common ground.
But then you look at Athens, a completely different pagan audience on Mars Hill. He didn't start with Moses.
No. What did he do?
He started by acknowledging their religiosity. He pointed to their altar to an unknown God. He met them right where they were, built a bridge before presenting the gospel message, showed how it was relevant to their world.
That leads perfectly into this idea of redemptive analogies. Our sources call them 21st century parables.
Yeah, it's a powerful concept. Think of them as God-given parables for today, using stories, symbols, traditions that are already there in a culture to explain spiritual truth.
Like finding a familiar bridge to cross an unfamiliar river.
That's a great way to put it. The sources mention missionaries connecting with the Sawi tribe in Papua New Guinea through their own peace child tradition to explain redemption.
Wow.
Or finding connections with the Yali tribe's idea of places of refuge. It's about finding those existing cultural hooks that God has already placed there.
And there's another big shift in communication style too, right? From knowledge-based to experience-based.
Yes, definitely. Culturally, there's a trend where people often have an experience first, and then they look for the knowledge or framework to understand or validate it.
Okay, experience then explanation, rather than the other way around.
Kind of, and this impacts everything. Worship design, how we teach, even how we use sacred space. The message gets communicated not just through words, but through visuals, art, silence, testimony, story.
And preaching isn't just confined to the church building on Sunday morning.
Not at all. It happens in coffee shops, in homes, online, wherever people are connecting.
So let's talk about worship specifically. You often hear about the worship wars in churches.
Oh, yeah. Arguments over music style, liturgy.
Our sources seem pretty clear on this. Most of those battles are really about tradition and personal preference, not deep biblical authority.
That's exactly right. And churches that are successfully breaking the code, they're learning to navigate this. It means laying aside our comfort for the sake of connecting with others.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about Sojourn Church in Louisville. They planted among artists, waiters, a very specific subculture.
Okay.
Their services. Indie rock, loud music, lots of attendees with tattoos, facial jewelry. Probably not the style many traditional churchgoers or even the preacher himself would prefer.
Right.
But their way of doing the Lord's Supper, it was unique and it led to people genuinely weeping, praying together. It was deeply meaningful and incredibly effective for that community because it spoke their cultural language.
Wow. So it resonated because it felt authentic to them.
Exactly. Or a totally different example. A blue-collar church in Oklahoma City. Country western music was the norm. People might actually yell yeehaw during the sermon. Cowboy hats everywhere.
Sounds very different.
Very different. But a former prisoner, rejected by other churches, found salvation and real acceptance there because that environment felt safe and familiar to him.
So the point is, worship needs to create a safe space for both believers and seekers to encounter God. And it should take a form that feels familiar, resonant to the specific cultural group you're trying to reach.
That's it, not just what's comfortable for the existing members.
Okay, let's shift to evangelism. The traditional model is often come and see, right? Attractional outreach, invite people to church.
And that still has its place. It still works in some contexts.
Right.
But our sources really emphasize that it's usually most effective when it's combined with what they call incarnational ministry.
Incarnational. Like Jesus becoming incarnate, becoming flesh.
Precisely. It's where the church moves beyond just inviting people in, and instead it sort of becomes incarnate within the cultural expression of the community. It means going to them, living life alongside them, not just waiting for them to show up at the door.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, the gospel travels best along relational lines, doesn't it?
Almost always. And what's fascinating is that often the most effective evangelists are people who were recently unchurched themselves.
Why is that?
Because they still have strong connections, friendships with people outside the church. They invite their friends, their coworkers, and conversion in this kind of context often isn't a single event, but part of a longer discipleship journey.
So people might belong before they believe, in a sense.
Yeah.
Participate for months, even years, before a formal commitment.
That happens a lot. It highlights the need to remove unnecessary barriers.
What kind of barriers?
Things like image barriers, making church seem like a place only for perfect people. Or cultural barriers using insider jargon, music styles that feel completely alien, creating an atmosphere where newcomers just feel weird.
Like they don't belong.
Exactly. The only barriers we shouldn't remove, the legitimate ones, are the core truths of the gospel itself. The need for regeneration, repentance, and the call to fully commit to following Christ.
So real connection happens when...
Oh, an authentic follower of Jesus who is part of a relevant faith community genuinely engages with someone who's disconnected. That's the sweet spot.
Okay, so churches are realizing they need to adapt.
Mm-hmm.
What new models or strategies are actually emerging to help them do this?
We're seeing several key approaches gain traction. One is using multiple services.
But not just because the building is full.
No, often it's strategic. It helps maintain intimacy in smaller gatherings, provides different style options, maybe even targets specific groups like, say, young adults or families, all within the same church.
Interesting. What else?
Multiple locations or multi-site churches. This is big. Over 1,000 churches in North America now use this model.
So one church, but meeting in several different places.
Right. Same identity, same leadership structure, usually sharing teaching via video or other means. It lets them leverage resources and leadership to have a presence in different neighborhoods or even cities, reaching distinct groups without starting entirely separate churches each time.
And then there's a really small scale, right?
Absolutely. A huge surge in interest in house churches, or sometimes called koinos churches.
Koinos. That's Greek for fellowship or community.
Exactly. These are small relational groups meeting in homes, clubhouses, coffee shops, wherever. They tend to multiply, starting new groups rather than just getting bigger and bigger. It forms these networks of faith woven into everyday life.
These sound like significant shifts. Do we have examples of churches really making this work? Success stories.
Oh, definitely. The sources highlight some incredible examples. Take Mars Hill Church in Seattle, back in its growth phase.
Okay, Mark Driscoll.
Right. Planted with basically no traditional seminary or pastoral experience, it grew to around 5,000 people in one of the most famously unchurched cities in North America.
And they helped launch the Acts 29 network, too.
They did. Now, whatever you think about later events, what made them initially successful wasn't just size. It was Driscoll's raw, very culturally attuned approach that somehow resonated with the skepticism of that specific city.
Interesting. Okay, another one.
Mountain Lake Community Church in Cumming, Georgia. Started by Sean Lovejoy in a school cafeteria.
Humble beginnings.
Very, mostly unchurched people initially, but they grew to nearly 2,000 in just 2 years after getting their first building. The key was intentionally creating a community that felt welcoming and relevant to people who'd maybe never felt comfortable in church before.
That intentionality seems key.
It really is. Then there's Set Free Church in Yucaipa, California, Pastor Willie Dalgety.
What was their focus?
He gathered about 200 former bikers, addicts, homeless folks, people often on the margins. And from that core, they launched 27 daughter churches just in the LA area, plus others in Seattle, Atlanta. Started 40 churches in 10 years.
40 churches in 10 years. From that base, how?
Radical acceptance, a willingness to meet people exactly where they were, messy lives and all. They embodied the gospel in a really tangible way for that community. It wasn't polished, but it was real.
These are powerful examples. Is there a common thread?
I think so. These leaders and others like Bob Roberts at Northwood in Texas or Mark Batterson at National Community Church in D.C., they represent the sort of new breed.
How so?
They see their context through these missional lenses we've been talking about. They have this ability to really read the culture around them and then translate ministry into expressions that are both biblically faithful and culturally appropriate for their specific setting.
They didn't just copy a model from somewhere else.
No, they understood the process of contextualization and applied it uniquely.
Okay, so if a church or a leader wants to start this process, wants to break the code, what are the essential components? Where do they begin?
Well, one element our sources stress heavily, maybe surprisingly, is a deep commitment to personal spiritual formation.
For the leaders, for the members.
Both. Research cited suggests that something like 71% of the barriers to rapid church growth aren't external, they're internal. Issues of the head and heart of the existing church and its leaders.
Wow, 71%.
Yeah. It's about actually living and loving like Jesus, modeling a radically different way of life, and focusing on multiplying disciples who then multiply others. It has to start from a place of deep spiritual health.
Makes sense. You can't give what you don't have. What about leadership specifically?
The leaders who do this well share certain leadership qualities. They feel genuinely God-called to this work. They have a clear, non-negotiable vision for specific people and a specific place.
So not just a general desire to grow a church.
No, much more focused. And they also need to be able to build effective teams and, crucially, raise the financial resources, because this kind of work isn't cheap.
That raises a tough question, doesn't it? It sounds costly. Emotionally, relationally, financially.
Right.
Especially if it means breaking from comfortable traditions or the mainstream.
It absolutely is costly, but the question these leaders wrestle with and answer is it worth it? Think of Vance Pittman starting a church in Las Vegas, Sin City, or Andy Williams in the Midwest. Challenging contexts. They embraced that high cost because they believed reaching people who were far from God was worth sacrificing their own preferences, their own comfort, and they saw incredible responses.
So vision and sacrifice are key. What about support? Do churches do this alone?
Partnerships and networks are really crucial. Denominations can play a big role here, providing resources, training, connection, but we're also seeing new kinds of partnerships emerging.
Like what?
Well, here's a fascinating example. Warden Brocane at Angola Prison in Louisiana, he actually invited a seminary into the prison.
You did the prison.
Yeah, to train inmates as missionaries. And now these inmate missionaries are planting churches inside other penitentiaries, living 204/7 with the people they're reaching. Talk about indigenous ministry.
Wow, taking it to the ultimate level.
It really is. It shows how organizations, denominations, schools, they can bridge gaps, equip leaders, connect networks, set free church, the biker church we mentioned. They partnered with California Baptist College to train leaders who came from their own harvest field rather than just importing trained pastors from outside.
That makes so much sense, training people from within the culture.
Exactly. Indigenous leadership.
Okay, so we have spiritual formation, leadership, partnerships. What about the actual process of breaking the code? It sounds like a journey.
It absolutely is. It's a lifelong process, not a one-time event or destination. It starts with prayer, obviously, clarifying God's specific call for your context, and then it requires intentional information gathering.
Like market research almost.
Sort of, but deeper. You need to talk to the experts in your community, not just church experts, but local government officials, people on the planning commission, school board members, police officers, healthcare workers.
Why them?
They have invaluable insights into the real needs, the demographics, the challenges, the flows of life in your community, stuff you won't get just from looking at census data.
Okay, get the real story on the ground. What else?
It's vital to understand the existing networks and identify bridge people.
Bridge people.
Yeah, God is already at work everywhere, right? So find out who influences the people you hope to reach. Is it a local radio host, a particular newspaper, community leaders, politicians?
And the bridge people are?
They are individuals within the community who already have trust, who have existing relational networks. If you can connect with them, they can potentially allow the spiritual message to travel through their networks. It's not just about building your own network, it's about connecting with the networks that already exist.
That's a really key distinction. Don't just build, connect.
Right. And learn from others. Research indigenous churches. Find churches already reaching people similar to those you feel called to, either in your community or nearby.
See what they're doing right.
And what didn't work. Learn from their successes and their failures. Why reinvent the wheel if someone else has already paved part of the road?
Good point. Anything else on the practical side?
Yes, determine musical preferences. Seriously, understand what kind of music people in the community actually listen to, and see how other indigenous churches might be using music that connects culturally, which might be very different from traditional church music.
Okay, so it's a holistic process. Prayer, research, connecting, learning, adapting.
Exactly. It's deep listening and careful action.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, let's recap. We've explored how breaking the missional code is really about understanding and responding to these huge cultural shifts in North America.
Right. It means moving beyond just our own preferences, our own comfort zones.
And learning to see our communities differently, discerning specific people groups, population segments, cultural environments.
And then applying strategies that are both faithful to the Bible and genuinely appropriate for the culture you're in communication, worship, evangelism, discipleship, across the board.
Ultimately, the core idea seems to be about embracing being sent, seeing ourselves as missionaries right here in our local context.
That's it exactly.
Yeah.
Being willing to pay the cost, giving up preferences, maybe changing traditions to reach people in ways that actually resonate with them.
And the potential outcome.
When God's people are truly sent, empowered by the Spirit, reaching out to all kinds of people with this profound message, radical transformation really can happen. We see it in the examples.
It's a hopeful message, but also a challenging one.
It is.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, our listener. This whole deep dive, it really raises an important question, doesn't it? If breaking the code truly requires us to give up our own preferences, to genuinely step into the world of those we want to reach, what might you be willing to sacrifice? What might you need to let go of to make a meaningful difference right where you are?
And maybe just as importantly, what might you learn? What might God show you if you simply started by observing, really observing what He's already doing in the lives and the culture all around you?